For more than 30 years, every museum exhibit, every documentary, every school textbook, and every forensic reconstruction told the world the same story about the most famous prehistoric murder victim ever found. He had pale skin. He had a full head of dark, wavy hair. He was a typical ancient European with a mixed ancestry that researchers felt they understood. Every detail of that portrait, the one reproduced in millions of books and displayed in one of the most visited archaeology museums in all of Europe, was built on contaminated data. In August 2023, the team from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and URAC Research published a complete, high-quality resequencing of his genome using technology that did not exist when scientists first read his DNA back in 2012. What they found forced a complete rewrite of who this man actually was. The famous museum reconstruction is not his face. It never was. The man in question has been lying in a climate-controlled chamber in Bolzano, Italy, since shortly after he was found in September 1991. His name, the one the world gave him, is Ötzi, but researchers more often call him the Iceman, and the story of how he was discovered is almost as strange as what his DNA has now revealed about his life. Two German hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon were crossing a small glacial pass high in the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy when they spotted what they initially thought was a piece of discarded equipment or a doll lying face down in the melting ice. It was a human body. A man in his mid-40s, preserved by a combination of cold, dry mountain air and the specific geometry of a shallow, sheltered depression in the rock that had protected the corpse from the crushing flow of a true glacier for over 5,000 years. He still had hair. He still had skin. He still had his clothing, his tools, his weapons, and his last meal partially preserved in his stomach. He had been lying there, frozen since approximately 3230 BC, making him the oldest naturally preserved human mummy ever recovered in Europe. To place his lifetime in context, the Copper Age in the Alps was a transitional period between the stone tools of the Neolithic and the full bronze metallurgy that would come later, a time when farming communities that had been established across Europe for thousands of years were beginning to work metal in small but significant ways. The Alps in this period were not empty wilderness. They were a landscape of seasonal human use, with high mountain pastures exploited for summer grazing, passes used for trade and movement between valleys, and communities living in the lower elevations year-round. Copper was becoming increasingly important, both for practical tools and for the social prestige that possession of a well-made metal object could confer. The fact that Ötzi carried a nearly pure copper axe of sophisticated construction tells researchers he was a man of some standing, not a desperate wandering outcast, but someone with access to skilled metalwork in a world where that was not available to everyone. His equipment overall suggests a man who was competent, prepared, and purposeful, which makes the violent end of his journey all the more striking. The initial recovery was chaotic and damaging in ways that would matter greatly years later. Workers who extracted the body from the ice used jackhammers and improvised tools before archaeologists arrived and understood what they were dealing with. Clothing was torn, the bow was broken. DNA from dozens of human hands, without gloves, without any contamination protocol, was deposited directly onto the body and its artifacts in those first hours and days. Nobody at the scene initially grasped that they were handling one of the most scientifically significant human remains ever discovered. By the time proper preservation began, the damage was already embedded in the sample that would define scientific understanding of this man for the next 3 decades. What that mummified body carried with it from the Copper Age was extraordinary. His personal equipment represents the most complete assemblage of prehistoric human tools and clothing ever recovered from any site in Europe. His copper-headed axe, with its blade of nearly pure copper, hafted onto a yew wood handle using leather strips and birch tar, demonstrated a level of metallurgical sophistication that genuinely surprised researchers who assumed alpine communities of his era were still primarily working in stone. His clothing had been assembled from at least 4 different animal species: goat, sheep, cattle, and bear fur, each processed and tailored with skill. His shoe system was stuffed with insulating grass. His weapons included a longbow that was still unfinished at the time of his death, a quiver containing 14 arrows, only 2 of which had been completed and fitted with flint tips, suggesting he was in the middle of an ongoing journey when he died rather than returning from one. His body carried 61 tattoos, groups of lines and crosses placed primarily at joints and along the spine, in locations that correspond with startling precision to the therapeutic pressure points used in traditional acupuncture, hinting at a medical or ritual tradition far older and more widespread than anyone had previously documented. His death, when researchers finally understood it fully, turned out to be murder. For the first 10 years after his discovery, the cause of death remained uncertain. The body showed signs of injury, but distinguishing old damage from perimortem trauma was difficult with the analytical tools available in the early 1990s. Then, in 2001, X-ray analysis revealed something that had been completely missed for an entire decade. A small flint arrowhead was lodged deep in his left shoulder, buried in tissue so thoroughly frozen that it had remained invisible to earlier examination. The arrow had entered from behind at an angle that severed a major subclavian artery. The wound would have been fatal within minutes. He had been shot in the back. He was not a victim of an accident or exposure. He was a murder victim, and someone had shot him from behind, which suggests either an ambush or flight from a pursuer who finally caught up with him. The forensic reconstruction of his final days deepened the mystery further. Blood analysis on his weapons and clothing identified DNA from 4 separate individuals, none of them matching Ötzi himself. 4 different people had bled on his equipment before he died. This indicates a violent confrontation earlier in his final days, possibly hours or days before the fatal arrow, in which Ötzi had fought with multiple opponents, injuring at least 4 of them before being shot from behind in the mountains. He had been running. Isotope analysis of his teeth and bones established that he had grown up roughly 60 kilometers south of where he died. In his final months or years, he had been living in a different valley, and he died crossing a high alpine pass. Whether he was fleeing enemies who had survived that earlier fight, whether he was a shepherd or trader caught in a territorial dispute, or whether something else entirely drove him into those mountains on that specific day, nobody has yet been able to determine with certainty. What is certain is that someone wanted him dead enough to follow him into some of the most difficult terrain in the Alps and shoot him in the back with a carefully aimed arrow. He was left there, face down, and the ice did the rest. When DNA technology reached the point where his genome could be read for the first time, researchers in 2012 published what was then the highest quality ancient genome ever recovered from human remains of his age. Published in Nature Communications, the study reported that Ötzi belonged to a Y chromosome lineage strongly associated with early Neolithic farmers who had spread into Europe from Anatolia beginning around 7000 BC. He carried genetic signatures from both that Anatolian farming migration and from indigenous European hunter-gatherer populations, giving him an ancestry profile that seemed to fit neatly into what researchers understood about the mixed populations of Copper Age Europe. Physical trait markers suggested he likely had brown eyes and, critically, relatively light skin. And adaptation researchers associated with the farming populations that had moved into northern latitudes where lighter pigmentation would have been advantageous for vitamin D production under reduced sunlight. The museum in Bolzano updated its famous life-size reconstruction accordingly. The pale-skinned, full-haired Iceman became the standard image reproduced in documentaries, textbooks, museum displays, and educational materials around the world for the next 11 years. That image was built on a lie that nobody had yet developed the tools to detect. Ancient DNA is one of the most fragile and contamination-prone materials that scientists ever work with. After thousands of years in the ground or in ice, the original genetic material degrades into short, broken fragments that mix indistinguishably with bacterial DNA, fungal DNA, and, most problematically, the DNA of every modern human who has ever touched the specimen. Ötzi had been handled without protective gear by multiple workers at the extraction site. He had then been examined, sampled, and studied by researchers from dozens of institutions over the following 2 decades. Every bare hand, every ungloved touch, every unsterilized instrument deposited modern human DNA onto the sample. The sequencing techniques of 2012 could distinguish ancient from modern DNA to a degree, using the characteristic patterns of chemical degradation that occur in aged genetic material, but not perfectly, and not at the resolution that would later become available. What makes this particularly important to understand is that the contaminating DNA did not arrive randomly. The people who handled Ötzi without gloves in those first chaotic hours of recovery were Central Europeans, descendants of populations that had been shaped by thousands of years of European history, including the steppe migrations of the Bronze Age and all the genetic mixing that had accumulated in European populations since Ötzi's own lifetime. Their DNA carried exactly the genetic components that Ötzi himself was supposed to lack: Western hunter-gatherer ancestry and steppe-related ancestry, the very signals that had appeared in the 2012 study and had been interpreted as part of Ötzi's actual profile. When modern European DNA from the people who touched him was mixed undetected into the analysis, it made Ötzi look more European, in the modern sense of the word, than he actually was. It blurred the extraordinary isolation of his actual genome into something that looked more ordinary, more expected, more like the mixed European populations that researchers were already familiar with studying. The 2023 study, led by Kay Wang as first author and by Frank Meixner and Johannes Kraus as senior authors, applied sequencing technology that had advanced dramatically over the 11 years since the original study. The new methods could recover more DNA from smaller samples, sequence it with far greater accuracy, and identify modern contamination with a precision the 2012 teams simply did not have access to. When the researchers stripped away the contamination and examined only the genuine ancient DNA beneath it, what they found underneath overturned the portrait that had been displayed in every museum and printed in every textbook since 2012. The contamination in the 2012 study amounted to approximately 10% of the total sequence reads, and the modern DNA that had contaminated the sample came overwhelmingly from Europeans, people carrying ancestry profiles with significant Western hunter-gatherer and steppe-related components. This was not a small error. In ancient DNA analysis, 10% contamination can fundamentally shift apparent ancestry calculations because the proportions being measured are often in that same range. When modern European DNA, which carries substantial hunter-gatherer ancestry, mixed with Ötzi's actual ancient genome, it made him look more like a modern European than he actually was. It diluted the signal of his real ancestry and introduced genetic components that were never his to begin with. When the contamination was removed and only Ötzi's own DNA remained, his ancestry profile looked completely different. Approximately 91% of his genome derives from early Anatolian Neolithic farmers, the highest proportion of this ancestry ever documented in any known European individual from his era. This is a genuinely remarkable number. By 3230 BC, the time of his death, most European populations had already been mixing for thousands of years. The original Anatolian farmers who had spread across Europe beginning around 7000 BC had intermarried with the indigenous hunter-gatherer communities they encountered along the way, producing blended populations that carried substantial ancestry from both groups. Most Copper Age Europeans reflected this mixing in their genomes. Ötzi barely does. His hunter-gatherer ancestry is far lower than any of his European contemporaries. And the finding that surprised researchers even more was what his genome does not contain at all. Beginning around 3000 BC, populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea and Caspian Sea, began one of the largest population movements in European prehistory. These people, associated with the Yamnaya archaeological culture, spread their ancestry rapidly and widely across the continent. Within a few centuries of their initial movements, their genetic signature had appeared in populations all the way from the Iberian Peninsula to Scandinavia. Modern Europeans carry substantial steppe ancestry. It is one of the fundamental components of European genetics today. Ötzi has none of it whatsoever. His genome is a frozen snapshot of a population that existed just before those migrations began, a population that had not yet been touched by the genetic transformation that would sweep through Europe in the centuries after his death. He was not merely old, he was the last clear representative of an older world. The physical appearance findings were equally striking. The 2012 study had reported that Ötzi likely had relatively light skin, consistent with the narrative that fair-skinned northern adaptations had already spread widely through European farming populations by his era. The 2023 resequencing found the opposite. The genetic variants associated with significantly darker skin pigmentation were present in his actual genome, and the light skin variants that had shown up in the earlier analysis were traced directly to the contaminating modern European DNA rather than to Ötzi himself. The light-skinned man in the museum reconstruction was a contamination artifact, a portrait built from the DNA of the people who had touched him rather than from his own ancient cells. This finding is consistent with what researchers have been learning more broadly about ancient European pigmentation. The light skin tone that characterizes modern Europeans appears to have become widespread only during the last 4,000 to 5,000 years, driven by selection pressure in populations that shifted to more plant-based agricultural diets and lost the abundant vitamin D they had previously obtained from eating meat and fish. Earlier European populations, including the Anatolian farmers who made up the overwhelming majority of Ötzi's ancestry, often carried variants for darker pigmentation. Johannes Krauss, one of the senior authors of the study, explained the broader timeline bluntly, noting that people living in Europe tens of thousands of years ago were as dark as people from regions much closer to the equator, because that is where modern humans originated, and the light skin adaptations now associated with Europeans took far longer to evolve and spread than popular assumptions had suggested. The baldness finding completed the demolition of the museum portrait. Ötzi carried genetic markers strongly associated with male pattern baldness, the hereditary progressive hair loss that affects a large proportion of men as they age. He was in his mid-40s when he died. The researchers concluded he was already experiencing significant hair loss and may have been largely bald by the time of his death. The full head of dark, wavy hair shown in the famous Bolzano reconstruction was not based on any real genetic evidence. It had always been an assumption, a conventional artistic choice that had been rendered in wax and presented to millions of visitors as factual reconstruction. The actual man who crossed that Alpine pass 5,300 years ago was almost certainly bald on top, considerably darker skinned than any museum display had shown, and genetically more isolated from the mixed European populations of his own time than anyone had understood. What the 2023 resequencing ultimately reveals is not just a corrected portrait of one individual. It demonstrates how severely early ancient DNA studies could be distorted by contamination that the technology of the time could not fully detect or remove. The researchers who published the 2012 study were not careless. They used the best methods available to them and applied the most rigorous protocols the field had developed at that point. The contamination they missed was genuinely difficult to identify with the tools they had, but the 11 years of advancing technology between 2012 and 2023 widened the gap between what was possible then and what is possible now, to the point where 10% contamination that had once been invisible became cleanly detectable and removable. The corrected picture that emerged underneath the contamination is what Ötzi's genome actually says, and it is fundamentally different from what the world was told for over a decade. Ötzi remains the most intensively studied prehistoric human in the history of archaeology. His gut bacteria have been sequenced and analyzed, revealing a strain of Helicobacter pylori matching South Asian populations rather than modern European strains, a finding that hints at disease ecology far more complex than researchers had assumed for his era. His last meal has been reconstructed down to individual plant species and cooking methods. His tattoos have been mapped and analyzed in relation to therapeutic traditions that appear to predate acupuncture by thousands of years. His tools have been traced to specific geological sources. His clothing has been analyzed species by species. His tools have been traced to specific geological sources. His clothing has been analyzed species by species. The tattoo research alone represents years of careful scientific work. The 61 marks on his body, created by making small incisions in the skin and rubbing charcoal or soot into the cuts, are the oldest tattoos ever documented on a preserved human body. Remarkably, rather than appearing to be decorative in any obvious way, they cluster almost entirely at locations associated with chronic pain and inflammation. X-ray and CT analysis of his skeleton showed signs of joint disease at almost exactly the locations where the tattoo clusters appear, suggesting the marks may represent a therapeutic practice aimed at managing the physical discomforts of life in his mid-40s. The correspondence with traditional acupuncture points has drawn serious attention from researchers studying the deep history of body-based medical traditions, since it raises the possibility that some form of organized knowledge about pressure points and their relationship to health was circulating across Eurasia far earlier than any written medical text records. Whether this represents independent discovery of the same anatomical logic, or some genuinely ancient shared tradition passed across enormous distances, is a question that remains open. And yet, for 11 years, the face on the reconstruction was wrong, the skin tone was wrong, the hair was wrong, and the ancestry profile was significantly distorted. The man millions of people had learned about through documentaries and museum visits was a composite creature, part ancient truth and part modern contamination, presented as complete knowledge when it was still incomplete. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, where Ötzi's actual preserved body is kept in a refrigerated chamber, held at conditions replicating the mountain ice where he lay for 53 centuries, will need to update its reconstruction. The famous life-size model that has greeted visitors for decades will have to be rebuilt to reflect what the 2023 data actually shows. The textbooks will need revision, the documentaries will need updating, but the deeper lesson of this resequencing goes beyond any single reconstruction. It is a reminder that science is a process, not an archive of settled answers. The portrait of the past is always being revised as tools improve, and certainty about any ancient specimen studied decades ago should be held lightly because the technology that can read that specimen more accurately may not yet have been invented. Certainty about any ancient specimen studied decades ago should be held lightly because the technology that can read that specimen more accurately may not yet have been invented. The Ötzi resequencing is not an isolated case in this sense. Researchers in the ancient DNA field have openly discussed the fact that other famous specimens studied in the earlier decades of this science may carry similar contamination issues that have not yet been revisited with modern methods. Any ancient genome study conducted before roughly 2018 was operating with significantly less powerful contamination detection tools than are available today. And the more extensively a specimen was handled before proper protocols were established, the more likely its early genomic portrait contains some distortion from modern DNA that slipped through the filters. As the field continues developing more sensitive techniques, other portraits of ancient individuals may need revision. The specific finding that 10% contamination can fundamentally shift ancestry calculations in ways that change the entire narrative of who a person was is a warning to how carefully older ancient DNA results should be treated when making broad claims about prehistoric population history. The man who walked into those mountains 5,300 years ago carrying an unfinished bow, a pouch of medical equipment, and the blood of 4 other people on his weapons was darker skinned than modern Europeans, probably balding. almost entirely descended from farming communities that had arrived in Europe from Anatolia thousands of years before his birth, and genetically isolated from the mixing that had already transformed most of the continent around him. He was shot in the back from a distance, bled out within minutes, and lay face down in the ice while the world changed completely around him. Entire civilizations rose and fell while he was lying there. The steppe migrations swept across Europe and reshaped every population on the continent. The Bronze Age came and went. The Iron Age came and went. Rome rose, Rome fell. Every human who lived between his death and the moment Helmut and Erika Seaman spotted him in 1991 lived and died without knowing he was there. And then, in a laboratory in Leipzig in 2023, a sequencing machine finally read his DNA accurately for the first time and told us who he actually was. We are still learning to see him clearly. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology has confirmed that its reconstruction will need updating to reflect the 2023 findings. The famous wax figure that millions of visitors have seen standing behind glass, pale-skinned and full-haired, will be rebuilt. The real Ötzi was a different man, and the museum that holds his actual body owes its visitors an accurate portrait rather than a comfortable one. What that updated reconstruction will look like, when it is completed and unveiled, will be the final physical statement of what 32 years of intensive scientific study, including one crucial correction made possible only by a decade of advancing technology, have determined about who this man actually was. A man darker than anyone imagined, balder than any portrait showed, more isolated in his ancestry than any of his known contemporaries, and murdered on a mountain pass more than 5,000 years ago. Finally, after all this time, closer to the truth.